It's easy to feel a bit overwhelmed by the constant updates on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? The shifting front lines, the endless debates about aid.
Absolutely. And, beneath all those daily headlines, there's this really deep, complex history. And this recent talk of a potential reset, well, it really makes you look again at the core issues.
Exactly. It feels like what might look like a sudden explosion in February 2022 actually has roots going back decades.
For sure. And this proposed reset idea,
Hmm.
it kind of forces us to confront those underlying problems and
Yeah.
what the long-term fallout might be, maybe with more clarity.
So yeah, that's exactly what we want to do in this deep dive. We're going to unpack the key events, the moments that brought us here, and then really dig into the potential implications of this Trump reset plan that's being talked about.
We're drawing on quite a range of reports, analyses, news articles.
Right, and the goal really is to give you listening a clear, concise handle on how this conflict has evolved and where it might be heading next, kind of cutting through the noise.
Yeah, providing the context, maybe spotting some patterns, and just understanding the different forces at play, both historically and with this new proposal.
Okay, so let's dive into that history then. The period after the Soviet Union collapsed, say between 93 and 2014, that feels absolutely crucial for setting the stage.
Oh, it is. You have to start with the Budapest Memorandum in 1993. That's huge.
Right, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest arsenal in the world at the time, wasn't it?
Exactly. In return for security assurances from Russia, the U.S., and the U.K. But there's an immediate tension there, isn't there? Especially when you think about NATO expanding eastward later on.
Yeah, it raises that question about security assurances outside of formal alliances like NATO. How solid are they really?
Precisely. And then you have NATO expansion itself, wave after wave.
The Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland by 99, then the Baltics and others in 2004. You can see how, from Moscow's perspective, that looked like it was creeping right up to their border.
Definitely. Understanding the Russian viewpoint is, well, it's essential, even if you don't agree with it. They felt promises about NATO not expanding eastward, maybe made around German reunification, were being broken. That feeling of being encircled, it definitely fueled a lot of mistrust.
And inside Ukraine itself, there was this constant push and pull, right? Different visions for the country. Yanukovych leaning towards Russia, then the 2004 Orange Revolution pushing back.
And the U.S. backing for the Orange Revolution, that's key too. It highlights the external influences. Ukraine wasn't, and still isn't, monolithic in its outlook. These internal divisions are deep.
And Russia saw that Orange Revolution as Western meddling, didn't they, in their sphere of influence?
That was certainly their perspective, which again raises questions about how outside powers get involved in other countries' politics.
Which then takes us to 2014, a massive turning point. Yanukovych rejects the EU deal. You get the Euromaidan protests, again with U.S. and European support. He's ousted.
And boom, Russia annexes Crimea almost immediately. It felt like crossing a Rubicon.
Yeah. Euromaidan, driven by that desire for closer ties to Europe, was seen by Russia as, well, another case of the West exploiting Ukraine's divisions.
And the annexation, justified by Russia as protecting Russian speakers, was a clear violation of sovereignty. No question.
Then the conflict ignites in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russian-speaking populations rebelling. It's framed as this clash between Ukraine wanting its own path versus Russia feeling encircled.
Exactly. It's sovereignty versus perceived encroachment. That whole period just laid bare these long, simmering tensions about Ukraine's place in Europe and that fundamental issue of self-determination versus, territorial integrity.
Okay, fast forward to February 2022. Full-scale invasion. Putin's speech. The special military operation, the historical justifications, criticizing Lenin, NATO's broken promises?
It was quite something, using history, or a particular version of it, to justify aggression. The critique of Lenin, the NATO betrayal narrative, those were central.
And the stated goals, demilitarization and denazification,
Right.
widely seen as, well, propaganda.
Pretty much. Masking the real objective, whatever they precisely were. It makes you think about how leaders use history as a weapon, really.
And the scale of it was shocking. The U.S. intelligence warnings about the troop buildup, 150,000 troops, turned out to be spot on.
Tragically, yes. And that detail about the U.S. sharing intel with China, hoping they'd intervene.
Only for China to reportedly tell Moscow.
Yeah, that's the report. It just shows the incredibly complex, almost tangled web of relationships between the major powers, and maybe a lack of trust.
The invasion itself, multi-pronged. From Belarus toward Kyiv, hitting Kharkiv, coming up from the south, the naval blockade.
The initial strategy clearly seemed to be a quick decapitation strike on Kyiv.
Mhm.
Get in, get Zelensky out, install a friendly government.
That was the assumption, yeah. Russia probably underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight back.
Massively underestimated it. The resistance was fierce right from the start.
And those Western weapons played a big role, didn't they? Javelins, Stingers, those Turkish Bayraktar drones.
Absolutely critical, especially early on. Those weapons, Ukrainian tactics, sheer motivation. Surprised a lot of people and exposed some real Russian weaknesses in planning and logistics. Javelins became almost a symbol.
Yeah, they did. We saw a heavy bombing of cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, but also reports of Russian convoys stalled, running out of fuel. It didn't seem to be going to plan.
No. And the world was just watching in horror, really. A major land war in Europe.
The global shock turned into action pretty fast on the economic front. Sanctions, described as swift, unprecedented. How big a deal were they?
Oh, they were huge, kicking major Russian banks out of SWIFT. That's the system for international bank transfers, basically. Freezing around $700 billion of Russia's foreign reserves.
Wow.
Major companies pulling out, closing airspace, going after oligarchs' assets. Think Abramovich. What was really striking was the coordination between the U.S., EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia. That level of unity was pretty new.
And the immediate impact looked severe. The ruble crashed, the stock market shut down, those queues at ATMs.
Yeah, the initial shock was real. Financial instability. But the Kremlin acted fast to stabilize things.
Capital controls, banning people from taking foreign currency out, pushing trade towards so-called friendly nations.
Exactly. Those measures did put a floor under things in the short term, but they also isolated Russia further and, warped their economy.
And then the whole tech dimension, a very 21st century aspect. Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, blocking Russian state media like RT and Sputnik.
It was fascinating. These private companies effectively becoming geopolitical actors, aligning with Western policy. It raises big questions about corporate power and national interest.
Right, and you had hacktivist groups like Anonymous hitting Russian websites, Russian infrastructure.
And Russia hitting back by blocking Facebook, Instagram, moving toward its own internet infrastructure, a sovereign DNS.
Yeah.
Like their own internet phone book they control.
A digital battlefield opening up.
Definitely. Showed how vulnerable we are to cyber attacks and how the internet itself could fragment. That idea of a digital iron curtain suddenly felt very real.
And these Western tech giants, their links to the U.S. government, the military-industrial complex, seem quite deep. Sources mention Pentagon studies, billions in contracts over the years.
It's not a secret, but yeah, the connection is strong. It positions these companies as, instruments of U.S. influence in many ways.
So when they shut down accounts, blocked app stores, restricted Google Pay or Apple Pay, it wasn't just a corporate decision.
It was part of a much broader coordinated strategy to isolate Russia economically and technologically.
And Russia's response, pushing their own MIR payment system, looking at China's UnionPay, banning Western platforms, that's a clear move towards decoupling, isn't it? Building their own digital sphere.
A very deliberate effort. Less reliance on the West, which has huge long-term implications for, how the internet works globally.
Meanwhile, Ukraine was using social media brilliantly. Crowdfunding, mobilizing support, even meme warfare.
Incredibly effective. They really mastered the narrative war, keeping international attention focused, countering Russian disinformation. It was key to getting aid and support.
And that brings us back to the resistance on the ground. Zelensky staying in Kyiv, that was huge symbolically.
Absolutely pivotal. It rallied the nation and projected this image of defiance that Russia probably didn't expect at all.
And people volunteering from all over the world to join the International Legion. Some countries even changed their laws to allow it.
It showed the level of global outrage. The actual military impact is debated, but symbolically, very powerful. Plus, you had private military contractors involved too, adding another layer.
And the Western weapons and intelligence clearly helped stop that northern assault. Russia pulling back from Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, that felt like a major turning point in late March 2022.
It was a huge setback for Moscow. Showed Ukraine could defend itself effectively, especially without Western backing.
We heard incredible stories, too. Civilians resisting, farmers towing tanks, Molotov cocktails.
Yeah, those images, whether totally accurate or maybe amplified a bit, created this powerful narrative of a whole population resisting.
And Zelensky's addresses to parliaments everywhere kept the pressure on internationally. So Russia failed in the north, and then they shifted focus, right, to the Donbass and the southern coast.
Exactly. They had to recalibrate, concentrate forces on consolidating control in the east and south.
But as they pulled back from the north, the horrors of Bucha emerged. Mass executions, bodies burned, mass graves. Just awful.
Bucha sparked global condemnation. War crime accusations flew. Russia denied it, claimed it was staged, which didn't help their standing. India calling for an independent UN probe was quite notable.
And the war shifted heavily to the Donbass, became this brutal grind. Siege tactics, constant artillery, Mariupol, Severodonetsk, just leveling cities.
Very similar tactics to what Russia used in Chechnya in Syria. Utter destruction of urban areas, targeting schools, hospitals, malls. The humanitarian cost was immense.
Slow, grinding advances for Russia in Donetsk and Luhansk, but at a terrible cost in lives on both sides.
Just incredibly high casualties. A real war of attrition set in.
Then Russia formally annexed parts of 4 regions after those referendums that nobody really recognized internationally.
A clear violation of international law, again. But capturing Mariupol gave them that land bridge to Crimea, which was a key strategic goal for them.
Still, reports kept coming out about heavy Russian losses, even generals being killed. It showed the cost for Russia, too.
Definitely indicated the challenges they were facing and the effectiveness of Ukrainian defense in inflicting damage.
So, switching back to the economy under sanctions, how did Russia actually cope long-term? They weaponized energy, demanding ruble payments.
They did adapt. That ruble payment demand for gas gave them some leverage. And initially, global energy prices were so high that the oil and gas revenue helped cushion the blow significantly.
And they pivoted trade, didn't they? Towards China, India, the Gulf states?
Actively. China became a huge buyer of discounted Russian oil, walking a careful line to avoid secondary sanctions but still helping Moscow out.
Also building ties in Central Asia, Africa, trading arms or energy deals for political support.
Yeah, trying to build alternative alliances, counter the Western isolation.
And internally, they tried to sanction-proof their financial system. Internal clearing, promoting gold.
Measures to reduce reliance on the West, yeah. But those have limits, create their own problems.
Because the long-term damage seems pretty unavoidable. The brain drain of skilled workers, losing access to Western tech, inflation, shortages. It sounds like the economy is fundamentally weaker, even if it didn't collapse immediately.
Oh, the structural damage is real and significant. Lack of tech imports, losing human capital, falling living standards. Those effects will linger for a long, long time. Hidden vulnerabilities despite the outward show of resilience.
So by 2023, it's basically settled into this grinding war of attrition. Ukraine had some counteroffensives. Kharkiv, Kherson, using things like HIMARS, Leopard tanks.
They reclaimed some territory, yeah.
Yeah.
But no decisive breakthrough against the heavily fortified Russian lines, the minefields.
And that battle for Bakhmut just became this symbol of bloody, pointless attrition, right? Huge losses on both sides for very little strategic gain.
A terrible meat grinder. Really underscored the futility and the human cost of that kind of warfare.
Russia kept hitting Ukraine's energy grid with drones, missiles, especially in winter. But Ukraine also started hitting targets inside Russia more often with its own drones.
Yeah, that showed Ukraine's capabilities were evolving, and they were willing to take more risks, escalate in certain ways.
And then the political winds shift, especially in the U.S. The Trump administration comes in, and by 2025, there's this talk of a negotiated peace.
That's a huge potential shift. Changes the whole dynamic of Western support. And you see debates heating up in Europe, too. France, Germany, about how long and how much support to keep providing.
At the same time, it seems like the war has become kind of normalized inside Russia through propaganda, suppressing dissent.
The Kremlin's information control is very tight. It makes any internal pressure for peace really difficult.
And globally, this whole conflict seems to have sped up that move towards a multipolar world. BRICS nations challenging Western narratives.
Definitely. And how the war is viewed varies so much. In parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, you hear interpretations through an anti-colonial or anti-Western lens, which makes diplomacy incredibly complicated.
Okay, let's really unpack this proposed Trump reset. Reuters reported on the details. Starts with an immediate ceasefire, technical negotiations, basically freezing the conflict in place.
That seems to be the core idea. A pragmatic, maybe you'd say cynical, way to stop the fighting now, even if it means accepting the current front lines, at least temporarily.
And the security guarantee for Ukraine. Not NATO, but some kind of ad hoc group. That avoids the NATO issue for Russia, but how reliable is a guarantee like that?
That's the million-dollar question. Ukraine would have to promise no NATO membership, though they could still pursue EU integration. It feels like a compromise Kyiv would struggle with.
A huge compromise. And then the territorial stuff. This is where it gets really tough. Reported details include de jure U.S. recognition of Crimea as Russian, so legally recognizing it.
And de facto recognition, meaning accepting it in practice of Russian control over the other occupied areas in the Donbass and the south.
That just sounds like legitimizing conquest, doesn't it?
It's the most controversial part, absolutely. It goes
Mm.
against fundamental principles of international law and not changing borders by force.
But the plan apparently offers Ukraine something back. Retaining Kharkiv, regaining control over the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, the Kakhovka Dam site, maybe with U.S. oversight, guaranteed river navigation.
It tries to balance the concessions with some gains for Ukraine. Whether it's enough? Highly doubtful from Kyiv's perspective, I'd imagine. Depends on the fine print, the guarantees.
And economically,
Mhm.
U.S.-Ukraine mineral cooperation, reconstruction funds, but also lifting some pre-2014 sanctions on Russia.
Trying to create incentives, maybe?
Yeah.
But lifting sanctions after everything that's happened, that's politically and ethically very difficult for many countries.
So Ukraine's reaction, reportedly strong objections. Accepting territorial losses is likely unthinkable for them. Giving up the NATO aspiration feels like undermining their sovereignty.
It would feel like a betrayal of everything they've fought for. Capitulation, essentially. And denying their right to choose alliances. That's fundamental.
And key European allies, especially in Eastern Europe, they must be deeply concerned.
Very concerned. They see it as undermining NATO, rewarding Putin's aggression, setting a terrible precedent, like appeasement, basically.
And lifting sanctions without accountability for Bucha, for Mariupol, that's a non-starter for many. They see it as abandoning core principles for a quick fix.
A strategic retreat, potentially, that erodes the whole post-World War II order.
Okay, so let's try to sum up this deep dive. We've gone from the complex history post-Soviet collapse, through the invasion, the fierce resistance, the global economic and tech fallout.
The shift to brutal attrition, the current stalemate, and now this potential, very controversial peace proposal from the Trump administration and the pushback against it.
And we have to keep remembering the human cost. Over 1 million casualties estimated, cities devastated, millions forced from their homes. It's staggering.
The sheer scale of the tragedy is immense. It highlights why peace is needed, but also why achieving a just peace, one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty, is so incredibly difficult.
And the ripple effects globally are undeniable. NATO's expanded, Germany's rearming, Europe's trying to ditch Russian energy. That digital iron curtain is more real.
And the world feels more divided, more multipolar. This war has been a catalyst for massive changes, accelerating trends that were already there. The consequences will be felt for a very long time.
So as we finish up, maybe the question to leave you with is this. What would a frozen conflict in Ukraine really mean? If peace comes by accepting borders changed by force, what does that do to the idea of national sovereignty?
Yeah, what are the hidden costs, the unforeseen consequences down the line of normalizing territorial gains made through war? It's something the world is going to be grappling with for decades.